Video games are very carefully designed so that everything you need to know by the time you get to the end of the game, you have learned how to do. If a video game introduces a new mechanic at the very end of the game, they've done a bad job. Because everything leading up to the end of the game needs to be set up, needs to be established, needs to be fully ingrained in the player's mind. You're gonna do the same thing with your first act. Hello, I'm Michael Christensen, and I am getting ready for National Novel Writing Month. I was going to write a novel this November, but the novel I was going to write was going to be about a person running for president, and then there's a real election going on, and I'm going to hold off on that novel until reading about elections does not make me want to die. So I'm probably going to focus on short stories during that time, and then I'm going to get into the president novel once things are not the way they are right now. But if you are getting ready for National Novel Writing Month, and I hope you are, especially if you haven't done it before, I've done it, and I think it is really, really helpful for getting words on the page and being productive. I cannot recommend it enough. And if you are doing it, then we need to talk a little bit about how you're going to begin your book, because you're getting ready to do that in just a few days. So let's talk about your first act. The first act of your book has to set up everything that's coming after it, which means I think it really is the hardest part of the book. A lot of people talk about endings and how endings are hard, and they can be. And a lot of people talk about second acts and how hard second acts are, and trust me, I know and I feel you. But I think the first act is actually the most difficult. I think if you have a problem with your second act, you really have a problem with your first. There's a quote from Robert Rodriguez, the filmmaker, where he talks about editing, where if somebody says that he has a problem in a scene, he won't cut that scene out. He'll cut the scene that came right before it. Because that's really what you need to think about when you're thinking about setup, is how everything is affected by what came before. And all of that starts with your first act. It starts with setting up your character, setting up your world, and setting up your story. Now, there are a lot of resources out there. There's a whole book called Save the Cat that is all about making sure your character is likable and how to write characters that your audience will like. And also, I think Save the Cat is kind of bad, but it's worth a read. It just shouldn't be your Bible, which is what it is for so many filmmakers. It's fine. It should not be the be-all, end-all of your writing. I also just wrote a blog post about suspension of disbelief, and in that regard, I think Save the Cat completely gets something wrong, but you can read that on my blog. But Save the Cat is right about one thing. You need to make sure your character is likable. Asterisk, maybe not, because there are two reasons why someone enjoys a story. One is if a character is likable, and two is if they have to know what happens next. If you're not going to have likable characters, that's okay. You don't need likable characters for everything. There are lots of stories out there that don't have likable characters, but they have this feeling that you have to know what's going to come next. If you are going to have a likable character, or not, your first act is a time to make it very clear to your audience what they're in for. We've talked a little bit about the promise of the premise and about audience buy-in, and the first act is where that all happens. You need to make sure your audience is crystal clear about what's coming next in the story. Because it isn't just about setting up what's coming, it's about making sure that the audience is invested. It's challenging, I'm not gonna lie to you, but the nice thing is you can always go back to your first act and add stuff in. It is harder. Don't get me wrong, it is much harder to add things than to take them out or to change them, but sometimes you're gonna have to. Your first act is probably where you're gonna add the most content, because you don't necessarily know the shape of your story yet. Even if you outline every scene and you know how every scene reinforces what's coming at the very end of the story, once you get to the end, you're going to know things that you didn't know. And once you read it all the way through, you're going to realize some deficiencies maybe you didn't realize you had. It's going to be time to go in and add some stuff to the first act, or subtract things, or just tweak things and change them to make sure that you are really fully selling where this is going. Because that's a big part of it. Your audience needs to really understand where the story is going. People sometimes complain about things being predictable. I knew exactly where the story was going. And that's not always a bad thing. If I show you the first half of the movie Jaws, I hope that you know roughly where that movie is going. I hope that you know, after I only show you 10 minutes of the movie, that they're going to try to hunt that shark. And it's going to be scary, but hopefully they're going to do it. I am not guaranteeing you that they're going to survive, but I'm guaranteeing you that this is about a shark. If I showed you the first 10 minutes of Jaws and then the next 90 minutes of Seven, those 10 minutes are bad. they do not serve that story. Because it doesn't matter how well set up everything else is or how good the rest of it is. It doesn't fit, it doesn't match. This is a problem with a lot of right by the seat of your pants stories, and it's something I dealt with a lot in the superhero novel. In fact, when going back and rewriting, I realized that the first act of my superhero novel was more or less focused on one character, and then the rest of it was focused on the other character. I had two main characters at the time, so part of my big revision was condensing them down into one character. It took a lot of work. It was not an easy process, and ultimately the novel is 1,000 times stronger for it. And I knew where the story was going with two characters, and I got there by the end of it, and then I was done, and I realized that didn't work. And not that it couldn't have worked, but it didn't work. I wasn't making it work. Anything interesting that I thought I was doing by talking about these two characters going through these two different paths, I realized I could just make one character going on sort of conflicting paths. I think that's going to be more interesting for that book, and more interesting for the life of that series as I keep writing books in that story. And also, the other character just wasn't interesting. That's what happens sometimes. Even if you have things outlined, which I didn't, but I've done this as well with things that I've outlined, you will realize partway through that something isn't working, and you have a choice to make. Because you have to figure out how you're going to finish the novel. Just know that you can go back and change the things that have done a bad job setting it up. In the superhero novel, I was setting up a love interest for future books, and I was going to have her be involved at the end of the story, and then I realized as I got closer to it, oh, this doesn't work at all. She should maybe be introduced in the next book, or in a completely different way in this book. I don't know. I need to figure that out. So I just stopped writing about her. She just stopped showing up halfway through the book, which means that there are scenes of her in the first two acts that don't pay off. That's okay. You can go back. You can rewrite. You can take those out. Very easy to change that stuff. But that's why your first act has to do so much heavy lifting, and that's why your first act is going to be so challenging. And I promise you, just stick with it. Just remember you can change these things later on. The first act is about the promise of the premise. We need to understand what the story is about. By the premise, by the bit. Because your setup isn't just your setup. I am going to borrow a phrase from Wag the Dog, one that I reference a lot, and I've talked about it before when talking about premises and all of these things about suspension of disbelief. And I'm going to talk to you about the contract with the audience. When we watch Jaws, we understand that there is a shark and it is hunting people, and by the time the first act is over, we are invested. We want to see this shark stopped. That's what the story is about. The contract with the audience is give me your time, I give you the shark. Seven, a movie that has quite a few twists and turns, still gives us a very formulaic setup and contract. We are given a serial killer, we are going to be produced a serial killer by the end of the film. Minority Report, we are given a conspiracy, we are given the promise that this conspiracy theory will be understood by the end of it. The audience is owed closure because you have opened the door to a conspiracy theory that must be resolved before the story is done. Take some time and think about your story. What do you need to establish in that first act? What is it important that the audience understands? One of the big ones is your setting, and that's important, but only as important as it is for understanding your story itself. I'm writing a superhero novel, so a lot of work is done in the first act, making sure that you understand as an audience member superheroes are a thing, this is how commonplace they are, this is how they're discussed by characters in the world, and all of that is important because by the end of the first act, we need to have some context when our hero is thrust into the world of heroes. As superheroes and superpowers become a part of her life, we need to understand everything that implies, everything that is entailed in getting wrapped up into the world of superheroes. Or, if not everything, at least everything that she can be prepared for. Everything she can expect. We need to understand her state of mind. If she only knows superheroes from what she's seen on the news and what she's seen in interviews and what little she knows from cultural osmosis, that's what she's going to know about superheroes. But we as an audience don't know any of that. These are new superheroes. This is a new setting. None of this exists. So we, in that first act, I have to make sure that the audience understands what the world looks like. But I'm also giving you a main character, hopefully making her likable. That is something that I always worry about. I don't know if I need to worry about it or if I did a good job. That's just how my brain works. I don't know. I always feel like I'm worrying about main character likability. I think it is a very fine line to get your character likable, but also interesting. We'll talk about characters some other time, I promise. But it's not all about setting up your characters. You need to set up your world, and you need to set up the situation. That is honestly the most important one. You can go back later on and clarify the character at the beginning. You can go back later on and clarify the world at the beginning. If you do not clarify your story at the beginning, the audience, even just your alpha or beta readers, will bounce off it, because it is so important that you understand what your story really is. You have to make sure that your first act is efficient. There will be time in your second and third act to play around. That is what the second act is all about. But you gotta earn it first. Your first act needs to be very clear, and it needs to be where you prove to your audience that you know what kind of story you're telling. And again, you do not have to get it exactly right the first time, but you should know roughly what your story is about when you start writing. Because if you don't, you're gonna have a lot of meandering in your first act that you're gonna have to cut out later on. If you're an outliner, then just think of it very simply. Every scene needs to set up where the end of the scene is going, where the end of the book is going, where the end of your trilogy or your quadrilogy or quintuplogy, where everything is going. Every scene needs to be in service of that. If you're a pantser, if you're writing by the seat of your pants, you're gonna cut some stuff later on. Trust me on that. That's okay. I did my whole first book pantsing, and I cut a lot more from the beginning than I did from the end. By the time I got to the end, I knew where it was going, and I knew what I was doing, and I felt more comfortable. The beginning was a lot slower. Is it still too slow? No. Don't fall in that trap. Imposter syndrome. Even strikes while you're filming a video. It's just the best feeling. First acts are hard. But the nice way to think about it, at least for me, is that I think the first act is by far the hardest part. Third acts are just about making sure that everything you've set up gets paid off. Second acts are challenging, absolutely challenging, and it's where a lot of people get lost, and we're going to talk about that next week. I think I have some solutions for how to address second acts. But your first act is where you need to do the most work, and it's the most grueling. There's nothing around it. I'm sorry. It's just going to suck. Your first act hurts. But just remember, your first act is in service to your third. Everything that happens in your first should pay off later. And if it doesn't, you can cut it out later. Because your first act needs to be the most important, unfortunately. People can forgive bad endings. Stephen King has a very long career, and he has a lot of bad endings in his books because he has really good beginnings and really solid middles. And that's because he's very good at making sure the audience is on board early and they understand the premise and what's going on. Stephen King and Neil Gaiman both do really good first acts. And it's all about making sure the audience understands what's coming. And that's all it is. That's really all the first act is, if you get down to it. It's just making sure the audience is fully prepared for what comes next. And that's it. That's the video. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up button. And if you want to further discuss this, because I think there was a lot to discuss about first acts, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and make sure to ring the bell. I used to joke about it, but actually ringing the bell is important for like analytics, I guess. I don't know. I don't know how YouTube really works, but please ring the bell. It's cool. If you are not doing National Novel Writing Month, that's okay. Just enjoy doing writing. Keep on writing. Godspeed. Good luck. Bye. I love you, Victoria.